So I collected for you some of the most viral speeches given at Oxford Union related to God and Christianity. We'll start with some of the harshest critics of Christianity, and then we'll progress to an absolutely brilliant response to criticisms against Christianity, which I hope you'll stick around to see. As always, I'll try my best to make sure to add comments that you'll find interesting and insightful. And if you don't like them, I'm sorry, I still need to add them to make this video fair use. Alex O'Connor, also known as CosmicSkeptic, is a British YouTuber and philosopher. I actually think he's a pretty interesting guy, even if I don't agree with him.
We've heard a lot about arguments, but as a psychological phenomenon, I wonder how relevant these really are to God belief. That is, when you hear somebody recounting a conversion story, how often does it really begin with premise one? You're more likely to hear a narrative or a story, some kind of account of an experience. Indeed, the most high-profile conversion, perhaps of this millennium, happened just a few weeks ago when the fifth horsewoman of new atheism, Ayaan Hirsi announced in a long and celebrated essay that she had embraced Christianity.
For context, here's a short clip of Ayaan Hirsi talking about her conversion to Christianity.
And then she asked me to design my own God, and she said, if you had the power to make your own God, what would you do? And as I was going on, I thought, yeah, right, that's actually a description of Jesus Christ and Christianity at its best.
So it seems like Alex is choosing to focus on psychological reasons people have for converting to Christianity that aren't strictly rational, instead of on the rational arguments for and against the Bible and Christianity. That's perfectly fine, but talking about people like Ayaan Hirsi really has absolutely nothing to do with whether God is a delusion or not, or whether Christianity is true or not. Alex is going to say some things later that I think are much more interesting.
I was far from the first reviewer to notice something rather peculiar about this publication. That is, its somewhat conspicuous lack of arguments for the existence of God or for the truth of Christianity. Instead, she devoted the entire thing to talking about culture. She talked about the looming threats of Russia and China, of global Islamism, of wokeism. I think that an essay which mentions Osama bin Laden, Vladimir Putin, and indeed Professor Richard Dawkins, exactly as many times as it mentions Jesus Christ, might tell us that we're looking at a conversion that is at best insensitive to the truth claims of religious belief, and instead an attempt to escape, or a result, I should say, of a desire to escape certain unfortunate social realities. That is where God appeared in a dream to Joseph or to Zechariah. It seems that the president of Russia appeared in a nightmare to Ayaan Hirsi and also endowed her with a skill that I'm unable of, which is to adopt a belief simply because of its political or existential convenience.
Does it really matter why Ayaan Hirsi has chosen to believe in Christianity? Maybe Alex is right, and she's only believing in it because of political or existential convenience. But there are countless other Christians who have put forth rational arguments in support of the Bible and Christianity. I wonder why Alex has chosen to go after Ayaan rather than engage with those kinds of arguments. I do agree that the public conversions of high-profile people like Ayaan Hirsi, Jordan Peterson, and Russell Brand are definitely interesting to think about and discuss. But they are hardly the best representatives of Christian apologetics and philosophy.
And again, perhaps my desire for my philosophical convictions to be, true is just too high a margin to demand. What I really want to ask is whether this should be any kind of surprise, this approach, I mean. There is some recognition, even amongst the religious, that this is, at least in part, what religion does, what religion is. It provides some kind of unifying ethic to suppress the more depraved elements of our human nature.
But a lot of other people would say that religion is also a lot more than this. That religion comes from God, who created the universe and the human race, and revealed objective and universal truth to the human race through the Bible. Again, Alex is making some interesting observations, but they really have nothing to do with the most important questions related to God, the Bible, and Christianity.
Evelyn Waugh was once asked how he reconciled his private hedonism and gluttony. He was accused of being rude and self-indulgent, how he reconciles this with his professed Christianity. He accepted the charge and simply said, "Can you imagine how much worse I would be if I wasn't a Catholic?" Fair enough. I think that I'm far from the first to suggest that religion is, in essence, nothing more than a mimetic entity that serves some kind of social purpose like this, that's what it's for, but isn't actually true. And I'm glad to hear that at least one member of the opposition this evening seems to agree with me.
Of course, Alex can suggest anything he wants, But that doesn't mean he's anywhere close to being right. Honestly, I couldn't care less about the opinion of one random Catholic. I'm still waiting for anything resembling an actual rational argument from Alex, which I hope we will get soon.
I'm not sure if you'll see it that way too, ladies and gentlemen. But I won't say that I know this is the case. Of course, I can't do so. I will simply ask a question of you. What would you expect to see if God existed and all of this was being supervised? What would you expect the world to look like? How would you expect life to have evolved?
Well, as a Christian, I would expect the world to look like what the Bible teaches, which is that the world is now infested with sin and suffering, that there is only one answer to this problem, Jesus Christ, and that life on earth will never be free from sin and suffering until Jesus returns again to make all things right. And that's kind of exactly what I see. But I don't think that's the kind of answer Alex was implying with his hypothetical.
And if we assume the alternative hypothesis, that is atheism, materialism, that is that the world we find ourselves in is just an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms competing in an endless struggle for survival, what would we expect to find? And what do we find? A system of natural selection which explains the origin of species on planet Earth, that does not just cause or bring about, but relies upon suffering and death. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and destruction of the unfit. 99% plus of all of the species, let alone animals, that have ever inhabited this planet have been brutally wiped from existence. And for what? For our development?
But Alex missed an important step here. Before we can even get to the atheist materialist worldview, there are some prerequisite questions that need to be asked. Where did this universe come from in the first place? How did life originate in the first place? Alex mentioned human development, but how did human intelligence originate in the first place? The Bible has philosophical answers to all of these questions that are consistent within its own worldview. But these are philosophical questions that atheism and materialism really have no answer to. And jumping over them blindly isn't really a rational thing to do.
It seems that unimaginable, indescribable, and seemingly inexplicable suffering is embedded into the very mechanism by which I'm told God decided to create human beings. I'm not saying this can't be explained on theism. Of course I can't say that. You could say that this is all part of some grand plan of Jobian proportion in its unintelligibility. Maybe there's some kind of compensation in the afterlife. Maybe dogs do go to heaven after all.
It seems like Alex doesn't understand Christianity because the Bible's teachings about suffering aren't unintelligible at all. Suffering is part of God's eternal plan to glorify himself through the salvation of lost sinners through the suffering and atoning work of Jesus Christ on the cross. The reason why suffering on earth is so great is because it magnifies the depth to which humans have fallen and the height to which Jesus saves even enemies of God. Of course, suffering is emotionally challenging to grapple with, but rationally it makes complete sense within God's plan for the human race and for salvation through the suffering of Jesus Christ.
Sure. I'm just asking you what you would actually expect to be the case. I think that we wouldn't expect to see anything like what I've just described if we assume that there is a benevolent invigilator overseeing the process.
If this is the best Alex can come up with, then I'm sorry, this just falls completely short of actually being any good argument against Christianity. Alex just says, I think we wouldn't expect to see anything like what I've just described. But as we've already covered, the Bible teaches that what we see on earth is exactly what we should expect because of sin, rebellion against God, and the fall of the human race.
However, if we assume atheism, not only do we come to explain this phenomenon, but in my view, we also come to expect it.
Again, this only works if you jump over foundational philosophical questions about the origin of the universe, of life, and of human intelligence. Alex bases what he is saying on the assumptions that he can just say, I don't know, to all of these questions and expect nobody to challenge him on whether atheism and materialism are possible as worldviews in the first place.
If I'm wrong, however, if the truth of theism is indeed as plain and graspable as many on the opposition would doubtless like to suggest this evening, then I must ask why religious belief has traditionally, if not essentially delusional in essence, relied so heavily on, if you like, non-rational modes of convincing. A sign as sure as they come of delusional belief is an inability to muster and a resistance against rational defense of that belief, especially in the face of challenge, and most evident when the threat or enforcement, indeed, of suppression or physical violence is substituted in its place. That is the place of rational argument.
But there are Christians who do make rational arguments in defense of Christianity. Why doesn't Alex engage with those Christians and those rational arguments instead of dismissing Christianity because of other Christians? It seems pretty dishonest to say that Christians don't have rational arguments to defend what they believe because some Christians don't use rational arguments. That's a logical fallacy, and it's actually kind of ironic that Alex seems to be using this non-rational argument against Christianity.
And this hardly needs explication. Just 600 feet from the door of this chamber, there's an easily missable cross on the floor of Broad Street, which marks the spot where 3 bishops of the Church of England were burned at the stake. Not even for being the wrong religion, but so close, the wrong denomination, the wrong interpretation of the words. Doctrinal disputes like this have a long and violent history within the religious tradition, and I think it's worth asking why that's the case. Oh, you think that the Son proceeds from the Father alone, not the Father and the Holy Spirit. Oh, you're about to find out as you meet your Maker.
Again, this just has absolutely nothing to do with whether the Bible is true or not. The fact that some Christians have gotten violent over doctrinal disputes is completely irrelevant to whether Christianity is true or not. If anything, the fact that Christians are so passionate about getting the Trinity right is a testament to how confident they are that the Bible is true and that it's important to properly understand the Bible. These are not rational arguments that Alex is making. He's nitpicking a few things Christians do that he doesn't like and inferring that Christianity isn't true because of these things. That's not the way rational reasoning works.
Wherever religious authorities have had the political power to do so, I would say, and found the threat of otherworldly hellfire to have somewhat lost its efficacy on certain people, then they provide, shall we say, a corporeal simulacrum of this, bringing the flames into our own vale of tears, providing a very worldly inferno to ready the heretic for the inferno that's to come in Hades, reducing heretics to literal ashes in the full view of anybody else who might have the temerity to question or to challenge the authority and compassion of the Church. Why might a religious tradition, which I'm told is balanced upon reason and provability, evolve such a knee-jerk mortal resistance to freedom of thought?
Again, this is completely irrelevant. The fact that some Christians do what Alex is saying has absolutely nothing to do with the rational arguments that other Christians do make. It seems like Alex is trying to sway the audience emotionally with arguments that really have absolutely nothing to do with actual rational arguments for or against Christianity. Also, people using violence and not allowing freedom of thought is kind of a universal human thing, not just a supposedly Christian thing. There are tons of non-Christian governments around the world today, such as China, North Korea, and many Middle Eastern countries, where disagreeing with the government is responded to with persecution and death.
Of course, in our modern age, where the state is no longer the principal auxiliary of religious violence, I of course understand that that's the case. This is something that happened hundreds of years ago. Now that ignoble mantle is taken up instead by individual religious fanatics who cannot and will not be deterred by the morality of their fellow creatures or indeed by the laws of their country, because there is no legislation written by any person of any time that could even count 1 iota against the dictates of the supernatural creator of the universe, access to whose precise and exacting will is, of course, only a delusion when it's somebody else's God, when it's the wrong God.
Again, nothing Alex is saying here has anything to do with rational arguments for or against Christianity. He's basically just ranting against people he calls religious fanatics, which is an ad hominem attack. Alex doesn't give any benefit of the doubt to Christians. Maybe these supposed religious fanatics actually have good reasons to believe the Bible and Christianity are true, and that if these things are true, then some laws in the country are atrociously evil, and fighting against them is the morally right thing to do. Just because Alex doesn't like what some Christians are doing has nothing to do with whether Christians are right or wrong. If Christians are right, then it's right for Christians to live according to what the Bible teaches. And if they are wrong, then he should be arguing against the rational arguments they present, instead of just saying they're delusional, which is a logically fallacious argument.
If that's not the case, then not only is this belief in God and access to his will not delusionary, but now, I'm told, is actually a prerequisite for reason, for science, for morality, all of the noble pursuits that humanity entertains. This despite the fact that most of the important developments historically in all of these areas have regularly been made by dissidents who subverted the clerical authoritarianism of the very religious traditions that now wish to claim these developments as their own. A touch scandalous, I think you'll agree. I hope you'll agree.
Alex finally brings up something interesting, which is the argument that the Christian worldview provides the foundations for science and morality. But unfortunately, instead of engaging with these kinds of rational arguments for the Christian worldview, Alex just says that, quote, most of the important developments historically in all of these areas have regularly been made by dissidents who subverted the authoritarianism of Christianity. But Alex doesn't mention that Isaac Newton, one of the most influential scientists in history, was a devout Christian and believed that studying the natural world was a way to understand God's creation. Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, was an Augustinian friar whose work laid the foundation for the study of heredity. Blaise Pascal, a devout Christian, discovered Pascal's law in fluid mechanics and made foundational contributions to probability theory, which are essential in fields like economics and science. Michael Faraday, whose Christian faith guided his belief in the order of nature, discovered electromagnetic induction, revolutionizing electricity generation and contributing to the development of modern physics. Examples like these highlight that Christianity has not only coexisted with scientific progress, but in many cases has inspired it.
Again, I can simply ask you what best explains this psychological condition. Might this suppressive and censorial historical attitude, which seems essentially tied to the history of religious thought, be compatible with the truth of religious claims? Of course. Absolutely. Is it better explained by an inability to provide serious and conclusive rational defenses of those beliefs?
Well, rational defenses of Christian beliefs have been provided by many Christian apologists throughout history. I personally find the philosophical presuppositional approaches of men like Gordon Clark and Cornelius Van Til very compelling. But there are other Christian scholars in the fields of science and history who also make stronger arguments in those areas as well. But Alex interacted with absolutely none of those rational arguments in his speech. He just said Christians have an inability to provide these arguments, which is just not true and pretty dishonest.
Maybe. Might this also explain the characteristic taboo on the criticism of people's religious belief that survives with us in many ways to this day?
Really? Christianity is undoubtedly the most criticized and mocked religion today. It's actually kind of a popular thing today to criticize and mock Christianity.
Perhaps also, I'm not sure. Might this also explain why faith, as we've already heard, that is, belief without evidence, just reflect on that for a moment. Might it also explain why this is proposed as a virtue, and indeed the foundation of belief in God? Blessed, after all, are those who believe without seeing. I don't know. It's not really for someone like myself who, strictly speaking, is an agnostic. It's not really for me to say, but I can only leave it with you and, I suppose, the remainder of the opposition. Thank you.
But faith isn't actually belief without evidence. It's simply trust in what the Bible teaches. Christians may have faith in something they don't physically see, but that doesn't mean they don't have good, rational reasons for believing the Bible to be true. To be honest, I'm actually really disappointed in Alex. Instead of engaging with rational Christian arguments, he himself engaged in irrational arguments against Christianity and accused Christians of being the irrational ones. Dan Barker is a former evangelical Christian pastor who became an outspoken atheist and co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, advocating for the separation of church and state and promoting secularism. In contrast to Alex, I kind of find Dan to be insufferable.
I used to believe in God, like our very articulate and eloquent speaker before us. I used to believe firmly in God. I was an ordained minister. I preached the gospel for 19 years. I felt this presence in my mind as I prayed. I got goosebumps as I was in communion with what I thought was the Holy Spirit of God. As I read the Holy Bible and read about the resurrection of Jesus, I dedicated my life to preaching that gospel that I thought was so real, that gave so much meaning, so much hope, so much beauty to the world. But I've changed my mind. I now know I was deluded.
You know, the Bible actually has something to say about people like Dan. In the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, Jesus talks about professing Christians who are really zealous at first, but then fall away from the faith. Let's see if Dan gives us any good reasons for why he thinks he was deluded.
But I went through a process, evangelical fundamentalist, where I migrated into more of a moderate, where I preached less hell and more love, into more of a more liberal stage in my life, until eventually I dumped out all the bathwater and I found out there's no baby there. It's just words, it's just arguments.
It's just arguments? I mean, I happen to think those arguments are better than your arguments, so I can say the same thing about your atheism.
But from the very articulate words we heard tonight, we didn't see any dots connected. We heard a lot of argument, but when it comes to evidence, only two pieces were offered, which we will probably get to: personal experience and the resurrection of Jesus.
But surely Dan must be aware that there are also other arguments in support of the Christian worldview. It's a little deceptive to say that just because he only heard these two arguments in a particular speech, that these are the only two arguments that Christians give in defense of the Bible. And in any case, he's completely wrong that this Christian only made those two arguments in the first place. I don't know why he thinks that.
If nothing comes from nothing, then God cannot exist, because God is not nothing. If that premise is true, that nothing comes from nothing, and if God is something, then you've just shot yourself in the foot.
What? That made absolutely no sense. The Bible teaches that God is eternal, which means he didn't come from nothing.
Today is Thursday. What does that mean, Mr. President? Thursday. What does it mean? It's the day that millions of people believed in the god Thor. There was a gap in understanding. There was a mystery. What is that noise in the sky? What are those lights? What is all this? What is that? It must be an agency. It must be some being or something, and they named it Thor. And today we have a day of the week. We don't have a Jesus Day, but we do have a Thor's Day that millions of people believed in, and maybe some still do. But that deity has found itself on the scrap heap of history, just like when I looked at the deity I used to believe in, the God of the Bible.
Comparing Jesus to Thor is both completely ridiculous and completely irrelevant. Jesus is a man based in history with historical writings about his life, while Thor is completely made up. Dan is trying to discredit Christianity with a comparison that is both irrational and emotionally manipulative.
It started for me with the simple idea that Jesus told a parable about the prodigal son. A parable is what? It's a fiction. It doesn't matter if the prodigal son actually existed in history. It was the moral tale that mattered. The ancient Israelites made up a parable or a metaphor about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and a talking snake. Look up in the dictionary the word fable. You will find it as a moral tale involving talking animals.
The Bible treats the prodigal son as a parable, but it treats Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden as a historical narrative. So Dan's saying that the ancient Israelites made up a parable about Adam and Eve is just an irrational, unjustified assertion. And bringing up the definition of the word fable is completely irrelevant.
We know that Adam and Eve could not have existed because of evolution. I assume everyone in this room accepts the solid fact of the evolution of the human species.
Actually, no, I don't accept the supposedly solid fact of evolution, and there are good reasons both biblically and scientifically not to. Obviously, we can't cover this topic in detail here, but I'll just mention the Cambrian explosion, the presence of red blood cells and soft tissue in discovered dinosaurs, and the lack of definitive evidence for macroevolution as things to seriously think about. Dan doesn't even entertain the idea that he could be wrong about this, which again is pretty irrational.
So Adam and Eve could not have been real people. It was a metaphor, and many Christians accept that fact. They know there's metaphor, figures of speech in the Bible. But in my process, if the prodigal son is a fabrication, if Adam and Eve are a metaphor, then what about this other character, this Yahweh, this Jehovah, this Elohim character? Where do you draw the line? When we know that humans are very good at inventing myths, like the turtle in my Native American ancestry, the turtle that swam across the waters, brought up the mud from the bottom, created the continents. A beautiful story, a wonderful metaphor, but that didn't really happen.
Well, if we are comparing the Bible as a worldview to other worldviews, then the line would obviously be where the Bible draws the line, which is that while the prodigal son is a parable, Adam and Eve are historical people, and Yahweh is the actual true God of the universe who exists. The problem with Dan is he's assuming everyone shares his starting point, which is empiricism. But starting points is the very thing under debate, and the Christian starting point philosophically is the Bible.
The God character himself is also one of those fictions I came to realize. Maybe a useful fiction, maybe it gave meaning, maybe it gave hope, maybe it gave purpose, a fiction nonetheless. The reason I am a non-believer today is because of the lack of evidence and argument for a deity. If there were any real evidence for a God, then by now someone should have won the Nobel Prize for pointing that out. Any scientist in the world would jump at the chance to say, here we go. I mean, if there is a hitherto unknown force of the cosmos that we haven't yet been able to determine, what scientist in the world would not love to make that point? That hasn't been done yet.
Why does Dan think science should be capable of coming up with proof for the existence of God? Now, science certainly points towards the existence of a God, since we can learn about the complex structures of things like DNA and the human eye and infer that these things probably didn't develop randomly and naturally. And this is pretty strong evidence for the existence of God. But obviously you can't use science to come up with a mathematical type of proof for the existence of God. Also, it seems pretty clear that whatever science does point towards the existence of God, Dan is going to find some reason to reject that science.
All we have are what we would call, and I think many believers call, God of the gap. The thunder and lightning was a gap that is now closed. The perhaps fine-tuning of the initial constants, perhaps the origin of the Big Bang. We do have some gaps in science. In fact, it is those gaps that drive science. Without those gaps, we wouldn't have scientific inquiry.
But these questions are not just gaps. They're foundational questions, and if a worldview such as Dan Barker's atheism doesn't have answers to these questions, then its very foundation is basically irrational. Again, Dan is assuming that everyone should have an empirical worldview, but the Christian worldview doesn't agree with that. Dan can say, we're working on those questions all he wants, but it remains that he still doesn't have answers to any of those questions. On the other hand, Dan claims that Christians blindly use God to cover over these quote-unquote gaps. But a worldview positing that God is the creator who designed the universe isn't actually an irrational starting point. It's a proposal for how the universe, life, and human intelligence are possible in the first place. Dan just doesn't like this proposal, so he dismisses it unjustifiably.
What we are offered with is faith and belief. And you were very eloquent in saying that you have a belief in a God, that what you believe is a God. But belief is not knowledge. Belief is simply an assertion, according to the Bible, that you believers believe. Belief is the evidence of things not seen, the substance of things hoped for. Belief is not evidence. Anytime you have to accept an assertion by faith, you're admitting that that assertion cannot be accepted on its own merits.
I'm kind of tired of people like Dan and Alex wrongly saying that faith is by definition irrational. No, faith is simply trusting what the Bible teaches, and there are very rational reasons to trust what the Bible teaches. In the same way, Dan and Alex trust the conclusions of science. Maybe one difference is that Christians don't physically see the object of their faith, but that doesn't mean there aren't rational philosophical reasons for having confidence in the things Christians believe in.
It doesn't have the strength to be accepted as any other, perhaps, scientific hypothesis would be taken. Do scientists gather together every Sunday morning in their scientific sanctuaries and bow their heads and sing, "Yes, the Higgs boson is real. I know in my heart the Higgs boson is real. I will have faith. I will be strong to this secular world who challenges my belief that the God particle is real. Amen." If they did such a thing, you would think they were pretty insecure on the concept, wouldn't you? That's what we find with faith, a constant puffing yourself up. Be strong, resist the world, believe in these absurdities in spite of the doubts.
This is so stupid and embarrassing for Dan. Does he know that Christians can have rational confidence in what they believe and recognize that singing is an important part of the Christian life? Instead of actually engaging with rational Christian arguments, Dan just props up his own imaginary version of Christians and attacks them. Of course, some Christians probably do fit Dan's description, but that has absolutely nothing to do with Christians who actually put forth rational arguments for the legitimacy, even necessity, of the Christian worldview.
The story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the absolute worst example anyone could possibly give for the reliability of the Bible. And I'm not exaggerating. Let me tell you why I'm not exaggerating. Many stories in the Bible are given once or twice. The resurrection story is given 5 times. You can compare them. Scholars have never been able to reconcile those contradictory accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. And besides that, and there are many of them, was the tomb open or closed when the women arrived? What message did the angels give? How many angels were at the tomb? And so on.
But there are actually plausible explanations for all of these supposed contradictions that have been offered by Christians. Just because Dan doesn't accept them doesn't mean the answers Christians have given are not valid. Is Dan ignorant of the answers Christians have given, or is he being dishonest about the biblical accounts regarding the resurrection? Because it's simply not true that scholars have never been able to reconcile the supposedly contradictory accounts.
Besides that, we see through the development in the first century of the Christian myth that the earliest stories were simple. There were no angels, there were very few remarkable events, but as you go 10, 20, 30 years later, you find more and more until you get to the book of John, where you find these outlandish stories. What you see in the development of the resurrection story in the New Testament is the development of a legend, starting simple, growing over time, getting more and more fantastic. It's a mistake to treat those accounts as if they were flat, as if they all happened at one time. We can see before our eyes the development from a simple, unvarnished, perhaps some element of truth in some story about someone who may have spiritually ascended, like we say grandma died and went to heaven. Maybe the early apostles said Jesus died and went to heaven, but that exaggerated. So the resurrection of Jesus Christ is not evidence for a God. And even then, it would just be evidence that a man rose from the dead. How do you connect the dots?
I actually agree with a little of what Dan is saying here. Of course, I don't agree at all with Dan's assertion that the Gospels are contradictory or inconsistent, since Bible scholars have answers to all of the objections Dan has. At the same time, although the resurrection of Jesus points strongly to the truth of Christianity, proving the resurrection happened in itself doesn't technically prove God or the truth of the Bible. There are limits to empirical arguments for Christianity, and that's why it's also important to learn and engage with philosophical and presuppositional arguments, which deal with the possibility of the universe, of life, and of intelligibility in the first place.
We suffer also from a coherent definition of a God. We have a proposition, this house believes in God. What is that word? What does that word God mean? There are many, and I don't have time to go into much detail, but there are many incompatible properties that many theists assign to this deity, much like saying this deity is a married bachelor. Can a married bachelor exist? Logically, it cannot. And there are mutually incompatible characteristics of this deity that many theists have put forward that make it a married bachelor. For example, God is supposedly an omniscient being who has free will. But if you know the future, you can't have free will. I'm not talking about human free will, and that's a big debate whether we have it or not. Even atheists disagree among themselves. But God, presumably, this being is a personal being with free will who knows his own future decisions. In order to have free will, whatever that means, there has to be a period of indeterminacy during which you truly do have options. I could choose coffee or tea. I could choose this or that. But if you know your future options, you have no choice. You have no freedom. You are not a free personal agency.
That's certainly true for humans, but Dan clearly does not understand the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is timeless, which means there is no future or period of indeterminacy for God. So since God is the one who created time, that means God is not bound by time. So when we say God has free will, we just mean that he does whatever he wants. There is no future to constrain his actions. God's omniscience has nothing to do with knowledge of his own future, since God is outside of time. It just means he knows everything there is to know. There's just no contradiction here. But Dan has shown that he just continues to parrot his talking points, regardless of legitimate answers that Christians have given in answer to them.
If your definition of God is that God is omniscient and free, he cannot exist. He's a married bachelor. I know theologians try to tinker with definitions. By the way, if God cannot change what he knows he's going to do tomorrow at 12 noon, that also puts some limits on his omnipotence, doesn't it?
Again, if God created time and is outside of it, then it's nonsensical to say that God knows what he's going to do tomorrow at 12 o'clock noon, which means that suggestion doesn't at all put any limits on God's omnipotence. These are really basic biblical doctrines about God, and it's amazing that Dan is either unaware of them or he just stubbornly refuses to accept them.
A lot of these arguments from design and teleology, for example, suffer from begging the question. It's rather like the man who is amazed. Look at how all these rivers were made to flow right along the state boundaries. How do you explain that? It must have been a massive feat of engineering, a huge economic development. How did they get those rivers to do that? Isn't that incredible? And yet that's how a lot of this teleological thinking is among how did the human eye evolve? How do you explain that? There must have been design behind it. It does look like design, doesn't it? Those rivers look like they were designed to flow right along those boundaries. It's an upside down kind of thinking, and in a sense begs the question. The whole idea that in some of these teleological arguments that complexity requires a designer.
I'm just still waiting for a good explanation for how complex things like the human eye or DNA can come from blind, random natural processes, which is what people like Dan believe. Just saying we're begging the question, merely by asking this question, doesn't actually answer the question. It's actually just avoiding the question.
And Richard, somewhere here, pointed out in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, anything that is complex enough to design functional complexity, any deity who could design has to have a mind that is at least as functionally complex as the thing that he designed, right? If your premise is that functional complexity requires a designer, if that's your premise, then the mind of that deity also must, by that premise, require a designer. And you get into this infinite regress of, well, then God needed a bigger God and a bigger God.
Well, no, Dan is imposing a definition of God that is not the biblical or Christian God. The Christian God is infinitely complex from eternity, which by definition does not require a prior designer. But Dan just doesn't like that this answer solves the problem he is presenting, so he just refuses to accept it and demands that Christians define their God in a way that he can refute.
I think most scientists prefer to just stop with what we do know rather than speculate endlessly about a mountain of turtles. Another lack that takes against the evidence for the existence of a God is the lack of agreement among believers. If there is a deity that you love and care about, why do no two believers agree on any social or moral issue? You name it. Gay marriage, doctor-assisted suicide, stem cell research, death, the war, you name these social issues we're struggling with. You find devout, praying, Bible-believing Christians on both sides of those issues. Paul wrote in the Bible, God is not the author of confusion. But can you think of a single book that's caused more confusion than that Bible? They don't agree. Why not? Why shouldn't it be clear? Why shouldn't this all-loving, all-caring deity make it clear to us?
The answer, once again, is super simple. Because sin exists in this world. God's goal isn't actually to make everything easy and to save every single human being, but rather it's to glorify himself through the salvation of rebel sinners who are transformed by his grace to see the truth of his revelation. And Dan is completely misunderstanding 1 Corinthians 14:33, and God not being the author of confusion. The context of this verse is chaotic practices within the church, and Paul was just saying that Christians should not do things that create confusion within church services. That there is a lot of confusion in this world is completely expected because of the prevalence and power of sin.
It is not. They have fought with each other over these issues. The 30 Years' War, which was based to some degree on the confessional differences over infant baptism and transubstantiation. People were killed. John Calvin had his friend Servetus killed over a simple misplacement of a preposition. The lack of agreement among believers is a serious problem towards the existence of an all-loving, all-caring God.
No, it's actually not a serious problem at all. Like we already said, some confusion is completely expected because of sin. At the same time, it's completely possible for there to be right answers about what the Bible actually teaches, and for some Christians to be right about what the Bible teaches and other Christians to be wrong. When Dan says that God is all-loving and all-caring, he's implying that God would reveal the truth to everyone and save everyone. But that's not actually what the Bible teaches. Dan is again imposing his own definition of God upon Christians, not dealing with the actual God of the Bible.
And then, of course, the problem of evil. And our previous speaker pointed out that that is probably the Achilles heel in theology. All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital, and you know there's no God, at least no good God. Maybe there's an evil God. Those children are dying at the same random rate, even though their parents are desperately praying, desperately loving those kids, wanting some kind of divine intervention, and yet, as Ann Gaylor says, who's the former president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, nothing fails like prayer. That would be evidence. If you could give some scientific evidence that prayer actually makes an organic difference, not just makes you feel better, but an actual difference in the real world, that would be something to put on the table. The fact that that's not put on the table shows that prayer is pretty much talking to yourself.
I'll just make 3 quick points here about the problem of evil and prayer. First, I want to know what Dan thinks evil is. If there is no God, and everything is just a result of random evolutionary processes, then why is it even evil for children in hospitals to be suffering? Isn't that just survival of the fittest and natural selection? As we've mentioned already, there is a fundamental problem with Dan's very philosophical foundations, which he completely ignores to take shots at Christianity. Second, we've already covered multiple times that unlike atheists, Christians actually do have a good answer to the existence of evil in the world. Evil exists because God has decreed to use it both to glorify himself through the saving work of Jesus Christ on the cross, and to give people greater joy in recognizing the depths from which they have been saved, and the heights to which they have been saved. Also, the existence of evil is a way for God to display the glory of his justice in punishing evil.
Finally, there's no need for a belief in God. Millions, tens of millions of people on this planet live happy lives, productive lives, moral lives, purposeful lives, lives of hope and meaning, without deluding ourselves that there are these invisible personalities populating some supernatural realm. We are quite happy, thank you, without that belief. Based on all of that, it is more likely to reject the proposition than to accept it. Thank you.
It's also possible that these millions and tens of millions of people that Dan is referring to don't recognize the philosophical foundation of the Christian worldview that makes their very lives possible, and they aren't giving thanks to the God who created them and is the source of all they are doing. We're talking about whether Christianity is true or not, whether it's the philosophical prerequisite to the existence of the universe, of life, and of intelligibility. Whether or not people are happy or think they need God or not is completely irrelevant to whether Christianity is true or necessary. Like Alex, it seems that Dan is pretty ignorant of the most important questions related to this debate. John Lennox is a Christian apologist, mathematician, and professor emeritus at the University of Oxford, known for his debates on science, faith, and the existence of God. I actually found out recently that John is the uncle of Kristen Getty, who produces Christian music that I really like. Let's see what John has to say in response to criticisms against Christianity.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I believe in God. I believe in the supernatural God who created the heavens and the earth. I believe in a God who holds the heavens and the earth in existence. I believe that on the basis of rational evidence, similar to the beliefs held by the founders of this house, who gave this university the motto, Dominus Illuminatio Mea.
I just thought I'd point out that neither Alex nor Dan talked about John's philosophical point here that the Christian God is the basis of rational evidence. It's really the most important and relevant question.
They saw no contradiction between faith in God and the utmost excellence in rational inquiry. And if I dare mention my alma mater of Cambridge in this holy place, I would remind you that on the door of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge are written the words, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them." And as we look at the rise of science in the 16th and 17th centuries, Alfred North Whitehead and many others commented that men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not ashamed of being both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. What I am amazed at is that serious thinkers today continue to ask us to choose between God and science. That's like asking people to choose between Henry Ford and engineering as an explanation of the motor car. When Newton discovered his law of gravity, he didn't say, "I've got a law, I don't need God." No, he wrote the Principia Mathematica, arguably the greatest work in the whole history of science, because he saw that God is not the same kind of explanation as a scientific explanation. God doesn't compete. Agency does not compete with mechanism and law.
We saw both Alex and Dan say that Christianity is opposed to reason and science, that Christians can only believe what they believe because of blind, irrational faith. But faith, science, and reason are not only completely and perfectly compatible with one another, it was faith in God and God's attributes that led some of the most renowned scientists like Newton to make the discoveries they did. Instead of dealing with this reality, people like Alex and Dan choose to attack irrelevant things that are much easier to attack.
Why is there something rather than nothing? Alan Sandage, the brilliant cosmologist who became a Christian in his 50s, said God is the answer to that question. But people are now so desperate to show that the universe created itself from nothing, which seems to me to be an immediate oxymoron. If I say X created Y, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. If I say X created X, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of X, which simply shows that nonsense remains nonsense even if high-powered scientists utter it. It reminds me a little bit of G.K. Chesterton, who said, "It is absurd to complain that it is unthinkable for an unthinkable God to make everything out of nothing, and then to pretend that it is more thinkable that nothing should turn itself into everything."
This is why what Dan said about the origin of the universe was so ridiculous. First of all, he never answered the question because he obviously doesn't have an answer. And second of all, there's simply nothing contradictory about an omnipotent and eternal God creating everything out of nothing. Because the point is that God has always existed and didn't need to be created.
"The heavens declare the glory of God," says the ancient psalm. And we've unraveled a bit of that, seeing the fine-tuning of the fundamental forces of nature. It's something that's so striking to scientists that it demands explanation. And it seems to me that Arno Penzias hit it right. He is the Nobel Prize winner who discovered the microwave background on which a lot of the evidence for the Big Bang is based. He said astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the right conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan.
Again, we saw Dan make a joke about rivers running on state lines, but he never actually gave an answer to how random chance and blind evolution could result in the complex universe we see around us today. Obviously, Christianity has an answer to this question, but if Dan just says, "We don't know yet, we're still working on it," then that means his worldview is missing the answer to a very foundational question regarding how his worldview could be possible in the very first place.
But I want to come to what I think is one of the fundamental arguments for theism. I take it this house believes in reason. That's why we're all here. And as a scientist, I believe that the universe is rationally intelligible, That is something that has struck some of the geniuses of science as demanding an explanation. Einstein said the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And Wigner talked about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. How is it that a mathematician thinking in her head in here can come up with equations that seem to fit the universe out there?
These are the kinds of topics I wish Alex and Dan would have talked about. Actual rational arguments that Christians make for the truth of Christianity and the existence of God. In particular, John is talking about the origin of intelligibility and abstract concepts like mathematics, which Alex and Dan seem to merely assume without justification.
Well, how is it indeed? Because the irony of the atheist position here is evident. My atheist friends, and I have many of them, tell me that the driving force of evolution, which eventually produced our human cognitive faculties, reason included, was not primarily concerned with truth at all, but with survival. And we all know, ladies and gentlemen, what has often happened and still happens to truth when individuals or commercial enterprises or nations feel themselves threatened and struggle for survival. A leading philosopher, Alvin Plantinga of Notre Dame, says if atheists are right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then they have given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including their atheism. Their biology and their belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Yet my atheist friends still insist that it is rational for them to believe that the evolution of human reason was not directed for the purpose of discovering truth. And yet it is irrational for me to believe that human reason was designed and created by God to enable us to understand and believe the truth. Curious logic.
I'm sure I'm biased, but I feel like John is actually addressing the key issues in contrast to Alex and Dan. Alex and Dan's foundation is the assumption that the universe is random, blind, and uncaring. If this is the case, then there really wouldn't be any reason to care about truth or rationality in the first place. Yet they seem to care very much about these things. Again, when we're talking about the truth of Christianity or the existence of God, we eventually need to talk about and compare the very foundations of the different worldviews, whether they are Christian or atheist. John is doing that. Alex and Dan completely avoided and ignored this.
By contrast with that, biblical theism asserts that ultimate reality is personal and intelligent, and the reason science works, and this was the motivating force that drove the great pioneers of science, is that the universe out there and the human mind in here that does the science are ultimately the product of the same intelligent divine mind. Human beings are made, we are told, in God's image, and that means that science can be done. That makes infinitely more sense to me as a scientist than atheism does.
Atheists have no justification for trusting in the uniformity of nature, which is the foundation upon which science is built. But Christians do. Alex and Dan love talking about science and how they care very much about it and how Christians are not scientific. Yet they completely pass over philosophical questions about how science can be possible in the first place, according to their worldview. These are the arguments worth discussing, not the junk we heard Alex and Dan ramble on about.
Now let me come briefly to ethics. Ethical behavior, like rational behavior, of course, does not itself require religious belief. This is consistent with the fact that humans are created in God's image as rational moral persons. But just as I suggest that rationality cannot be explained without the existence of God, so I dare to suggest that the existence of morality cannot be explained either. As modern science sprang from Judeo-Christian sources, so did the concept of human equality. Listen to atheist Jürgen Habermas, arguably one of Germany's leading intellectuals. He said that universalistic egalitarianism, from which sprang the ideals of freedom and a collective life and solidarity, the individual morality of conscience, human rights and democracy, is the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of continual critical appropriation and reinterpretation. To this day, there's no alternative to it. Everything else is just idle postmodern talk. And it seems to me he's hitting the core of something important. Because the value of a human being on which sits egalitarianism rests is based not on what the human being can do, but what she's made of, or how she's made in God's image.
This is obviously true. Alex and Dan love talking about the immorality of the Christian God and of why there is so much evil in this world. But again, they skip right over the fact that they don't even have a moral foundation in the first place. By what standard are they judging the Bible and Christianity? And why should anyone trust their moral standard over another moral standard? In contrast, if there is a sovereign God who created the universe, then it makes complete sense that there is one objective universal moral standard, the standard that aligns with the character and decrees of this God.
I never forget speaking on one of my many visits to Russia to a colleague in the Academy of Sciences. And he said, "You know, John, we thought we could abolish God and retain a value for human beings. We found we couldn't, and we murdered millions of them." And Alexander Solzhenitsyn has said, "If I'm asked, why is it that 60 million of my fellow countrymen were sacrificed?" He said, the answer is, we have forgotten God.
If evolution is true and survival of the fittest is the only rule in nature, then it makes complete sense that some people would have absolutely no problem with ending the lives of millions of people for their own personal gain. Does Alex or Dan have a problem with this kind of mass ending of human life? If so, why do they have a problem with it? As Christians, we believe in the value of human life as a creation of God in his own image, so there is something wrong with unjustifiably ending the life of another human being.
Science, of course, marvelous as it is limited. Even a Nobel Prize winner, by analyzing a cake, cannot tell why it was made. But Aunt Matilda, who made it, can tell you. She can reveal it to you. But if she doesn't reveal it to you, you'll never know. And that brings me to my next evidence. It's the same with the universe. We can analyze it magnificently, but ultimately, if it has a maker, and I believe it has, only he can tell us what it's all about. And he's done so in the powerful narrative of the Bible, in particular in its analysis of the problem with humanity, not simply in terms of behavioral breakdown between people, but a vertical breakdown of trust between us and the Creator. The unique solution to that problem is not simply in terms of human ethical development, although that's very important, but in terms of something far deeper altogether. The restoration of the fractured relationship with God through the salvation he has brought through Jesus Christ. A radical relationship that empowers us to live ethically from God.
I love that John, in the midst of presenting excellent rational arguments for the truth of Christianity, has included a presentation of the gospel to all the atheists who are listening to his speech. Because ultimately, it's not about winning the argument. It's about sharing with them the message of the Bible, with hope that some of them might recognize its truth, recognize their sin, believe in Jesus Christ, and be saved.
And here we reach what for me is the chief evidence, not only for the existence but the nature of God. It is Jesus Christ. He it was who not only taught the golden rule but embodied it, fed the hungry, healed the sick and suffering, and welcomed society's outcasts, brought honor and respect to the marginalized and ashamed. And he's brought forgiveness and peace to multi-millions around the world. He's able to do this, of course, because though he was a man, he uniquely never was only a man, but God become human.
The most important question anyone can answer is, who is Jesus Christ? Because if he actually was a historical person, if he actually was God incarnate, and if his teachings, now recorded in the Bible, are actually true and can be demonstrated to be true using science, history, and philosophy, then all humans will be judged by God according to how they respond to Jesus, whether they accept him as God, Lord, and Savior, or if they reject him.
The central evidence for this startling claim is, of course, his historical resurrection from the dead that launched Christianity in the world. This is, of course, ladies and gentlemen, a crunch issue. If Jesus rose from the dead, death is not the end and atheism is false. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, Christianity is false. And I remember at Cambridge as a student listening to the brilliant Sir Norman Anderson, a legal expert, going through forensically the evidence from his legal perspective as a brilliant lawyer. And he said at the end of it, "The empty tomb then of Jesus forms a veritable rock on which all rationalistic theories of the resurrection dash themselves in vain."
Unlike Thor, who Dan mentioned earlier, Jesus is a historical figure, which means the truth claims of Christianity can actually be examined and debated. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ are definitely very central to Christianity. But as Dan mentioned earlier, technically speaking, even if it could be proven that Jesus rose from the dead, that doesn't actually prove the Bible is true. There could theoretically be another reason Jesus rose from the dead. This is why it's important to recognize the role that philosophy, in analyzing the Christian worldview and the Bible as a whole, plays in demonstrating the truth of Christianity as a whole. Proving just one piece of the puzzle does not technically prove the entirety of the worldview.
Just finally now, as I read the Bible, I do not only find intellectual satisfaction, but I find a great deal of that. I sense the voice of God speaking to me. You say that's intensely personal. But ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked tonight about belief in God. And I want to strongly emphasize that God is not a theory, he's a person. And if the origination of me qua person is a personal God, then the most exciting thing really is there a possibility of getting to know God? And so I don't simply believe there is a God. I've come to know him and trust him. And I have strong reasons for doing so, because of Christ dying and rising again for me. And that has generated in me a sense of utterly unmerited forgiveness, acceptance, and peace. That has enabled me to face the ugly side of my own nature, and with God's help to do something about it. But it's enabled me to face something else. The hardest problem I face as a Christian is the problem of evil and pain. My niece getting a tumor at 22 that kills her. What do I say to my sister? And this is the hardest problem we face. But it seems to me that atheism here has no answer, because by definition, atheism believes that human death is the end, so there is no ultimate hope. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, we could stay here till midnight and beyond arguing, as has been done in this university for centuries, what a good God should, might, would, could, if not, possibly might, just could he not have done, and we'll get nowhere. So it seems to me there's another question we can ask, and it's this. Granted that life presents us with a double picture. We see some beautiful things. We see some ragged edges. We see hurt and pain, and we see joy. How can we come to terms with that? And it seems to me here is no simplistic answer, but a window into an answer, and it's this. If it is actually true that Jesus is, as I believe him to be, the Son of God, then we can ask the question, what is God doing on a cross? And the answer comes back at the very least. God has not remained distant from our human suffering, but has become part of it. And the other side of that is this. Because Jesus rose from the dead, he is going to be the ultimate judge. Now here's an irony, because atheism has no ultimate hope of justice by definition. The vast majority of people in the history of the world have died without justice and will die without justice. And if death is the end, then of course they have no hope of ultimate justice. But the promise in the New Testament, guaranteed by the resurrection of Jesus, is that he is to be the judge in the coming day. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are some of the reasons why I believe that God is real and worthy to be trusted. Thank you.
This is more of an emotional argument here at the end, which is fine considering the rational arguments John has already laid out. John is saying that Christianity actually provides people with hope and with answers to life's deepest questions. Why is there so much suffering in the world? Will evil be punished? Does my life have a purpose? In contrast, the worldview that Alex and Dan present is really hopeless and provides no satisfactory answer to these questions. Suffering has no meaning. Evil will not ultimately be punished, and my life ultimately has no purpose. So I just want to leave you with this question. Do you believe the Bible is true? Your answer to this will have eternal consequences. And I believe there are very, very good reasons to believe the Bible is, in fact, true.
I need something more than just because it works. Here's the answer. I'll give it to you and I'll unpack it for you. I choose to believe the Bible because it's a reliable collection of historical documents written down by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. They report to us supernatural events that took place in fulfillment of specific prophecies and claim that their writings are divine rather than human in origin.
Hi, my name is Mike. I'm a deacon, a husband, a father, a software engineer, and an amateur maker of videos. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to help me in my mission to spread biblical truth, just subscribe and watch these videos until the end, which will help the YouTube algorithm recommend these videos to more people. I'm committed to using the skills and gifts God has given me to glorify Him and communicate biblical truth. And I would be so grateful if you would come be a part of what I'm building. You can visit my website at joyfulexile.com to learn more about me and what I'm working on. I hope you're having a blessed day. I will see you in the next video, and remember, this world is not our home.